We do have a press statement and a report which will be available on your way out. My name is Jean AbiNader. I'm the president of the National Association of Arab Americans. Jean, first name, last name, A-B-I, capital N-A-D-E-R. And I'm here today as the president of the National Association of Arab Americans, and I'm also president of the National U.S. Arab Chamber of Commerce, headquartered here in Washington. The three of us have just returned from separate trips to the Gulf. We both came back Friday of last week. And while we were there, we had the opportunity to meet with Gulf leaders, both governmental and private sector, and discuss with them the American presence and role in the Gulf and what they anticipate might be the likely scenarios in the Gulf in the coming short period of time. We were so impressed by what we heard and by what has happened since we came back. We thought it was important that Arab Americans had the opportunity to speak out on events which are now occurring in the Gulf. We're trying to look at this from a number of different perspectives. Number one, what is the impact currently on U.S. policy of the different aspects of Arab reactions to conflicts and escalations of conflicts in the Gulf? Secondly, what are the implications in terms of congressional administration cooperation and public support in terms of forging a policy that makes sense in terms of America's interests in the region? And thirdly, we are concerned with the overall American commitment to the Gulf and how that will hold up over time. And so what I've asked my colleagues to do is address themselves to different issues that will bring our concerns into light. I'd first like to ask David Saad, who's the Executive Director of the National Association of Arab Americans, to speak about the American role in the Gulf as we see it and the dimensions of Arab cooperation with that role. David?
I'm going to give some brief perspective on our historical look at the importance of the Gulf, including the nature of our military commitment, and talk a little bit about the nature of that commitment today and the military problem. As many of you know, in 1943, King Abdulaziz in Saudi Arabia committed Dhahran Air Base to the U.S. for its facilities for use at that time in World War II. Ever since, there has been cooperation between the Gulf countries and the U.S. In a military sense in the region. It's no accident. Certainly now it's recognized that 2/3 of the world's oil reserves are there. And this is at a time when most of the major oil fields in the world are topping out in terms of their ability to produce, including the fields under the control of the Soviets. So that it's an area of tremendous superpower competition, an area of vital importance to the U.S. and to the West generally. Since 1949, we've had a naval force, U.S. Middle East force in the region. It's gone through a number of name changes over time. Our policies served us quite well through the 60s. It wasn't until the late 70s when, with the Iranian Revolution and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, we had to change from a policy of dependence upon two major relationships, the U.S.-Saudi and the U.S.-Iranian relationship, to keep calm, stability, and security in the region. At that time, a new American doctrine, the Carter Doctrine, was evolved, which called for American military action, unilateral if necessary, to keep access to the oil reserves of the Gulf, available to the U.S. and to the rest of the West. The start of the 80s brought the Iran-Iraq War, and we have had to be concerned with our ability to help see the Gulf kept secure, stable, free from foreign influence. Our manner of doing this our preferred manner has been to support the Gulf Cooperation Council states and certainly the linchpin of the GCC security apparatus, Saudi Arabia, in terms of its defensive ability. Let's be clear. The U.S. cannot maintain a force of 40 ships in that part of the world. It cannot project safely American force without the cooperation of the country which occupies the largest landmass there, 1/2 really of the border of the Gulf. And let's be clear of one other point. What with all the discussion of who's paying for the protection of the Gulf, the Saudis have spent $50 billion putting in a defense system which is completely interoperable with the U.S. system. In fact, it was designed by U.S. military authorities. It's there available to provide spare parts, to service the fleet, and even more importantly now, the AWACS flown by U.S. Saudi crews are the eyes of the fleet, and these AWACS are protected by Saudi F-15 aircraft. So we have to recognize, again, while there is much discussion of who's paying for this and a degree of cooperation, the U.S. fleet simply couldn't be there without the cooperation of the Arab countries in the region. Our discussions with senior U.S. authorities are such that they've told us that every single request that they've made of any of the Arab countries has been complied with. The Arabs are willing to do whatever is necessary to support proper American action. Just for general notes, you should be aware that the Kuwaitis have offered to provide fuel for the fleet and air fuel free of charge, that Bahrain does supply naval basing arrangements for the fleet. There are port of call privileges in the Emirates, allowing refueling, and there are both naval basing facilities and P-3 surveillance aircraft land-based facilities in Oman. So the amount of cooperation is considerable, and it's the only way, in fact, American military ability can be projected into the region. At this stage, I've done what I want to do, which is just give a brief history of the importance and give a little bit of a sense of the military problem and the degree of Arab-U.S. cooperation.
In light of that commitment, a great deal of our discussion had to take place with whether or not the commitment will hold up under the escalation of tensions in the Gulf. And I've asked Dr. Jim Zogby, the Executive Director of the Arab American Institute, to address himself both to the perceptions of the Arab leaders that we met with and also how that impacts on American public policy here in the United States.
My name is Jim Zogby. I'm Executive Director of the Arab American Institute. That's Zogby, Z-O-G-B-Y. I think that one could summarize the fears of those in the region in the following way. 47 ships, 29,000 troops, and no policy. Objectives, national interests, but no policy. There is fear that in this context, we're waiting for disaster to happen. For 7 years, the United States has watched this long and bloody war drag on. We heard that from the last days of the Carter administration to as late as middle of 1985, heads of state met with the American head of state and made very clear their concern that the U.S. take a position in the international arena through the United Nations to call for an arms embargo to defuse the dangerous war taking place in the north of the Gulf. They received continued assurances from the United States that in fact that was being done. The last such meeting took place in mid-1985, which is at, if we put on our Iran-Contra arms for hostages timetable, at about the same time that scandal is taking place. The point is that in spite of American assurances, our policies were not consistent either with our pledges or with our commitment to defuse that war and help end it. A continual flow of weapons has gone to Iran through Israel, beginning as early as 1980 from what we now know. Now, at the same time, disinformation has been supplied, and in general, a passivity on the part of this administration as well as other permanent members of the Security Council has allowed an uninterrupted flow of weapons to continue to fuel the fighting to the north. The fear that the Iran-Iraq war would spill over was a continuous one, and one that was expressed repeatedly to the U.S. administration. In fact, not only spill over, but destabilize the entire region, not only shutting off the flow of oil, but destabilizing existing governments in the region was one that was expressed repeatedly. The point is that the U.S. did not even begin to make an effort to enter into the situation until the Kuwaitis invited the Soviets, or accepted a Soviet offer to allow Soviet tankers to carry Kuwait oil to ensure that Kuwaiti oil would be able to travel safely through the Gulf. At that point, the U.S. entered. But even with our entry, and a massive entry it has become, the point is that the policy is not consistent with the objectives. I think that what we have seen is a prolongation of the war, a destabilization, and now a massive American entry into the region, but American entry into the region in a region where our standing is, one might suggest, at a low. At least one could suggest that. I think that one cannot remove from the minds of Arab heads of state and public opinion the American involvement in the Gulf from American Middle East policy in general. And what we have found is that continued concern over U.S. policy towards the Middle East in general is one which really calls into question the wisdom of a massive U.S. military involvement that is not an involvement that in any way is consistent with policy overtures designed either to end that war or to have a consistent approach to Middle East peace in a very general way. I think that in a very specific way, while there are variations on the theme, one could say that the best case scenario projected by leadership in the Arab world is that the United States support fully a UN Security Council embargo of weapons. To call for an embargo or to call for a truce without calling for an embargo of weapons is at best inconsistent and surely cannot lead to an unwinding of the conflict. And the danger is that a truce without teeth, or a call for a truce without teeth, is in fact not a call for a truce at all. It is the Security Council permanent members that are the major suppliers of weapons to the region. They must take the step to suspend weapons shipments to the combatants. That's number one. There must be an embargo to weapons to the combatants. Secondly, there is a fear of a massive unilateral U.S. military presence in the area. Is it a provocative presence? Can it provide security? In the context in which it currently is taking place, it is seen as not a stable presence, not a presence that can produce the kind of peace and security that the region so desperately needs. To make it a real presence that can provide security, it must, in fact, be supported by a policy that more specifically calls for the kind of embargo and, with an embargo of weapons, therefore, move toward a real negotiated settlement to the conflict. And finally, we must move towards allowing the Gulf states to defend themselves and to provide security for themselves in the region. I personally have never supported an arms sale to any country. But after returning from the region, I've become convinced that this arms sale that the administration is proposing for the Saudis is in fact necessary. We cannot allow the Gulf states to be at the whim of continued turmoil taking place to their north and to their east. They must be allowed the opportunity to defend themselves. They don't want the United States to be a defender of their interests in the region. They really want the ability to defend themselves. And I think that they must be given that opportunity at this point. I think that while all of us sit here daily picking up the papers or waiting for wire stories to tell us of impending disaster, because that's the sense, is that with the kind of presence we have, absent a clear and consistent policy, there is the danger at any moment that the region will erupt. We'll find ourselves in the middle of a shooting match with options either for entry in a massive scale into fighting or a pullout. It is imperative, therefore, that we consider policy options that are consistent both with our interests and also with peace in the region, which I think is ultimately our most dramatic interest. This is an election year. I think it is incumbent upon the nation. It is incumbent upon those who propose to lead the nation in the next 4 years that a policy be articulated which is radically different than those policies of the last 40 years. Our Middle East policy is a disaster, or one might suggest no policy at all. But no policy at all in the current Middle East is a disaster. We need an American policy. Arab heads of state desperately want America to articulate a policy and are watching this presidential election to see whether or not anything more will be made of it than has been made in previous presidential debates. The assessment of the past that Israel would be our defender in the region, that Israel is in fact a base that secures U.S. interests, has obviously proven to be false. It cannot provide security in the Gulf. Only Gulf states themselves can provide security in the Gulf. The U.S. has too many interests in the region, has invested too much in the region, has too much at stake in the region to have no policy to secure those interests and to secure the interests and the security of our friends. Thank you.
I'd just like to summarize by saying that the major question for us is, number one, the quality and consistency of the United States commitment. Are we in a situation that is analogous to the Iranian one, where the United States, at least in the Arab perceptions, pulled out their support for the Shah of Iran? Is it analogous to the Beirut situation, where, having declared Lebanon of vital interest to the United States, after losing people in 2 tragic bombings, the Americans pulled out? Is the American commitment something that is stable in terms of not only the immediate future, but the long term? In other words, Iran is on its own ground, and Iran can outweight the United States. So the question becomes, does the United States have something else in the bag besides the military presence there? And secondly, we feel there's a very strong responsibility for the administration, the public opinion, and Congress to come together to acknowledge the strategic value of the Gulf, as we have at different times, and recognize that the Americans need to develop a policy to react and be able to deal with changes in the situation over there, so that a real active effort on the United States is needed that involves diplomatic, economic, and military components, that there's public support for it. I think the last thing we want to see is the continued kind of inconsistency as what American initiatives are in the region. And so with that, what I'd like to do is open it up for questions, and you can ask any one of us. Yes?
Is it helpful that the United States seems to be supporting Iraq with rhetoric, if not actually sharing intelligence information with the Iraqis?
Helpful to whom?
Foreign policy of the United States.
I think the question here is, while there are some elements in the Arab world who think that it's about time America realized that it had interests that are clearly ones that are more on the Arab side of the equation than the Iranian side, that the real American interests are not in siding with one side or the other, but in creating an atmosphere and an international effort that will bring peace to the entire region. Let's not forget that it wasn't so long ago that the United States was calling Iraq the major destabilizing force in the Gulf. So it's this lack of ability to consistently define our policy in terms of our objectives that has us where we are today.
John, do you view the Saudi arms sales as a litmus test of whether the U.S. has a clear and consistent policy?
I think it's one part of the litmus test. I think that there's more importantly, a broader consensus that needs to be developed not only within the administration but in Congress, that in fact not only is the Gulf important to us, but we're willing to put a firm legislative and supportive program behind that resolve. I think rather than isolate the Saudi arms sale, I think we're talking here about a whole attitude that Congress has displayed administration toward the Gulf states, and that is, if the going gets tough, we don't support the sale, or from the administration side. And from the congressional side, anything that helps the Arabs is not in the interests of domestic political pressure groups who support Israel, and so we oppose them. And we're saying that we know what the American objectives are in the Gulf. Why can't we have a policy consistent with those objectives?
Well, besides the Saudi arms
Let me
sale,
just
what
add
else
to-
would you be looking
Let
at?
me just add to that what we're talking about here, both in the previous question and this question, are really pieces of policy. But pieces of policy don't necessarily, as we've seen in the last 10 years, add up to a consistent policy. What we're looking for is an overall consistent policy that adds up to a policy that will secure the region and secure our strategic interests and the interests of our allies in the region. That will first and foremost be dependent upon moves through the United Nations to enforce an arms embargo on the combatants and to bring about a negotiated settlement to the warring parties. On the one hand, a sale to the Saudis. On the other hand, to allow shipments of weapons to continue to go to the combatants. On the third hand, to have a continued massive U.S. presence in the region. All of that doesn't add up to a secure Gulf. In fact, it's pouring gasoline on flames. And what we want to see, rather than pieces of policy on the one side that seem positive, adding up with pieces of policy that are negative on the other side, we want a reassessment and a stance from the part of the United States that says the Gulf War must end, and the steps we must take to end it are this, this, and that. And then to secure our allies in the region by allowing them to defend themselves not only at this point but in the long haul. To simply send the Saudis weapons and at the same time to not make the other dramatic changes that need to be made in policy don't add up to securing the region at all. It really adds up to making the region possibly more destabilized. To have a single focused policy, the only place in the Middle East we have declared a focused policy is within relation to Israel. One might suggest, is a suicidal policy because it has destabilized the broader region. But in the Gulf, we need to have a comprehensive policy. We need to look at the Gulf region as a region, add the pieces up together, and come up with a consistent statement. I would say that one thing, that what we are doing as Arab Americans is adding that up ourselves. I know that the NAAA is planning a massive lobbying effort with regard to the Saudi arms sale. That's going to happen. But so too Arab Americans are going to make sure that in 1988 these issues are raised across the nation. People who want to lead the nation in the next 4 years must have an articulated policy toward the Middle East that is clearer, more consistent with our national objectives than the policies we've pursued in the last 40. So from both ends, Arab Americans are going to make sure this happens in the next year.
The U.S. has been saying this week they support and will go to the UN to ask for an arms embargo. The Reagan administration supports apparently arms sales to the Saudis, and we have a huge fleet there designed to keep the sea lanes open. I'm not quite sure what it is that the U.S. is doing or the administration is doing that you are critical of.
We're not concerned, as Jim said, as much with the individual elements the administration is doing. But let me take them in sequence, because you raised very important points there. Number one, the U.S. initiative at the United Nations. Why did it take the United States 7 years of appeals from Arab countries, the hostilities in the Gulf, hundreds of thousands of casualties, to make a move at the United Nations? It wasn't until the STARK was attacked and the Soviet presence became apparent in the Gulf, the United States made an effort at the United Nations. So the question becomes at the United Nations, what happens if the Soviet Union says, no, we're not interested at this point in time? Does the United States expend the necessary political capital to go forward with the Soviet Union, to bring leverage on them and France, the other major supplier, and China, the other major arms supplier, to bring them to support a comprehensive arms embargo to the region? What we're concerned about on that level, both in the international and also domestic politically in terms of the arms sale, for example, is that the administration will not expend or make a priority for what has to be done in order to bring about peace in the Gulf region. That when the heat is raised on the administration, they're going to say, well, it's easier to deal with the Contra peace issue, or we've got to worry about the posture of the candidates in '88, or, and we've seen this happen before on other initiatives in the Middle East, that when the heat's turned up, the administration crumbles, or the Congress takes a position that has nothing to do with what's best for American interests in the Gulf, but reflects primarily support for Israel in the American Congress. So on the arms issue, on the UN issue, and on the relationship of the United States to the Arab world, the Arabs' question is there staying power behind the American commitment to this area? And right now, they don't have a sense of that. And looking at the way the administration is going right now, frankly speaking, we asked the administration last week. We said, who in the administration is responsible for coordinating the arms sale? They didn't have an answer for us.
How can you have...
Let me just add to that the fact that while we're negotiating with the Soviets over arms reduction in Europe, the same kind of expense that Jean is talking about in terms of expense of national will and priority needs to be exercised at diffusing the situation in the Gulf. We have enough ships in the Gulf, and everybody else has enough ships in the Gulf, that we're going to be bumping into each other before long. The lanes aren't going to be open, they're going to be closed because we're going to have too many war vessels in the region. The point is that while we're talking about reducing arms in Europe, the real arms buildup is taking place in the Gulf. The same expense of energy and making it a national priority has to take place. Détente doesn't begin in Western Europe, needs to begin in the places where there are hot spots, where hot war actually can break out. We can come to a confrontation with the Soviet Union in the Gulf at this point in time. And to diffuse that situation becomes, we think, a national priority.
John,
I think David, who has been handling the relations with Congress administration on this, probably has some insight.
We're getting back to a major concern of ours. It's similarly a major concern of the Arabs in the region. It has to do with the consistency and follow-through, the staying power of American policy. They're looking back at some of the points that have been enumerated. The situation in Iran when the Shah fell, the situation in Lebanon. More recently, in the last 2 years, there was an arms sale proposed for Kuwait. The Congress had letters against it. The administration pulled it out. A few months back, an arms sale for the Saudis, and it was shaped specifically with an eye towards the Iranian threat. Some of the, if you will, pro-Israeli senators circulated a letter, got 70 signatures, and the sale was pulled. Now, the question is, both certainly by us and certainly by the countries whose national security is dependent on it, when it comes to a question of whether American national interest as will be served, at least American national interest according to stated policy, vital interest of the Gulf, supporting our friends in the region. If it comes to a question of whether those interests will be served or whether Israel's objections will be served, how will it come out here in the U.S. and what will the effect be on our stance in the region and ultimately on the Arab states in the region? That is the problem. We have got to change things. We've got to come to a situation where the administration can present policy and Congress can make its suggestions and support that policy, and it can be explained and supported by the American public. And this policy, if it's serving American interest, will be allowed to stand whether or not Israel objects. And that's the problem we've got now with respect to our deployment of forces and our emphasis in protection of the Gulf. The question of whether we can follow through on basic American security issues there if indeed some aspects of this plan runs afoul of Israel's interests.
A couple of questions related to security, John, you and Jim. Did you feel when you visited and you talked to the leadership and the people in the Gulf that they feel more secure by the presence of 47 ships and 28,000 American soldiers in the area? And the second question, which is related, did you also feel that there is a Russian threat that envisioned by the Kuwaitis or the Saudis or the Qataris or others in the Gulf at the present time?
Let me take those in reverse. In Saudi Arabia, we encountered the reaction that it was interesting that after, as Jim mentioned, that they among others, had been trying to get the administration to move on the Iran-Iraq war since 1979. And they said it was instructive to us that the United States took the initiative after the Soviet Union came into the Gulf. So they said maybe only by dealing with the Soviet Union can we get America's interests in terms of its own interests in the Gulf. So I don't think they feel that there's this threat from the Soviet Union as much as there is a concern that increased American blunders, provocations against Iran unnecessarily, overreactions to certain activities that Iran may undertake, may open new opportunities for the Soviet Union to increase its presence and its influence on Iran, which up till now is negative. So the question at this point is whether or not our mistakes will give them more opportunities on the Soviet question. On the first question, whether or not they feel more secure, I think you're talking about three different levels of security. The fishermen in Tehran who go out and see all the boats are not very secure. I think what they're most concerned about is not so much the overall military security. If you know anything about the Gulf region, you recognize that the Arab Gulf states, just because of the physical layout of the Gulf, are essentially defensive states. There's no way that Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and the Emirates can be aggressive about much of anything just because of their size and their shoreline and those physical realities. But secondly, their major concern is not from military invasion or military harassment by Iran or other unfriendly forces. Their concern is for terrorism. Their concern is that Iran has more options by which to attack and destabilize the region than they have the capabilities to defend themselves against. And I only have to point to the fact of the Mecca incident, which in some ways has stiffened Saudi Arabia's public resolve, but on the other side recognizes the vulnerability of Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states with regard to this kind of low-level violence and conflict that can take place. So they may feel more secure physically because it's giving them an ability to maintain a higher state of readiness. But it also leaves them, because of their physical configuration, more vulnerable to terrorist activities.
Maybe this will lead me to a question to David. David, what can you say about encouraging or having the Congress to approve the sale of arms to Saudi Arabia, the last $1 billion? And if the Congress, the U.S. Congress, will reject this based on the Israeli influence, what do you think that the direction of this policy will be?
If there is a Saudi sale proposed now, and the administration tells us they haven't yet made this decision, but certainly there are several elements of weapon systems waiting to be delivered. If these sales are proposed and if the Congress turns them down, it'll reverberate throughout the Arab side of the Gulf. There simply cannot be any confidence in placing stock with a pure American solution. This is the most troubling aspect of our whole problem. You have to remember that until the 80s, the Soviets had no diplomatic relations in the area. In the last few years, they've established diplomatic relations with first Kuwait and then the Emirates and Oman, so 3 states now. There's been a decided change of attitude. The Soviet Union is, after all, on Iran's border. It can exercise some direct influence. So if, as we all agree, the Gulf is vital to the West, and it's an important objective that we have influence there and that Soviet influence be kept to a minimum, it's critical that a proposed sale of equipment to the Saudis at this stage be followed through on and be supported in the Congress. And frankly, my one piece of advice is that those senators who have objected in the past, or those congressmen, not simply look at it as a piece of additional military capability in isolation to the Saudis, but rather look at it as part of the overall Gulf solution, a military capability which frankly supports the U.S. and which the U.S. supports, and hopefully one which, if developed sufficiently, would lead to the mutual defense framework there, the GCC, able to control events in that part of the world without our military exposure.
Let me raise 2 issues which I think are essential to understand in terms of the thinking of the Arab leaders, at least from my perceptions. Number one is that the American presence is not something that can be removed from the Gulf, in a sense that you cannot count on the GCC countries to develop in the next generation a capability equal to or even measurable against what the American presence is in the Gulf right now. In other words, in face of any large-scale onslaught, naval, Air Force, etc., the Gulf states don't have the capability. They don't have the forces to defend themselves on an individual basis or even a collective basis. The best they can do, and their strategy is one of defense until the larger powers can come and help them out. And that has always been the strategic thinking of the Gulf states. Their population, their geography, and the skill of the society where they're developing argue against their becoming militarily aggressive and also capable of defending the entire region. So the American presence is more or less a permanent feature in the Gulf. Regardless, we've been there 40 years. My guess is we'll be there at least another generation or two. Secondly, if America develops sufficient credibility in terms of its Gulf policy, this will very much, I think, help us in terms of where we've lost our credibility in other parts of the Middle East. In other words, if we can develop a policy which serves our interests and our friends' interests in the Gulf region, this will help rebuild the credibility that we've lost in terms of helping settle the Arab-Israeli issue, which to us is also central. You can't ignore the Palestinian issue is still central to peace in that part of the world. And so the credibility we hope that will evolve from a credible U.S. policy in one area, one part of the region, will serve us to help us pursue our interests for peace and stability in the other part of the region.
Let me just add, though, a concern over the size and the character of the U.S. buildup in the region, absent a consistent U.S. policy. For example, one Saudi leader said to us, "What happens if Iran attacks you? Do you retaliate? And if you retaliate, does that produce any desirable end? Or does it escalate the conflict and, in a sense, make Khomeini even more heroic in his own society?" A worst-case scenario is the U.S. actually being hit, as this leader pointed out to us, is the U.S. target being hit and the U.S. pulling out en masse. Another worst case would be the U.S. hitting and actually getting into a confrontation with Iran, which brings the Soviet Union in. Or Saudi or Kuwaiti targets being hit in their territory. In other words, a target in Kuwait being hit or a Saudi target being hit, and they having no ability to retaliate or to defend themselves because they simply lack the weapons to do so. The best case scenario, as articulated to us by everybody, was a move to defuse the war between Iraq and Iran. If there were embargo on weapons, the war could not last more than a month. That is clear to everyone in the region. Neither side has the ability to continue to wage that war without a continual flow of weapons coming in, resupply, spare parts, etc. To strangle off the combatants from weapons is the way to end the war. After that, we can fine-tune whatever else we need to do to secure the region. But the threat to the region at this point is the continued conflict between Iran and Iraq that destabilizes everything. A U.S. military presence, a massive presence, the size of which we have presently in the Gulf, does not contribute to ending that conflict as we are watching in the past few days. It not only doesn't add to it, but it makes a more dangerous Gulf because America is in the middle of a shooting match at the present time. The possibilities that we will be hit become all the greater. And if we are hit, then what? That's why I am suggesting to you that pieces of policy do not necessarily add up to policy. What we need is a peace policy, if you will, and not pieces of policy, because pieces of policy by themselves, in abstraction of a real comprehensive peace policy, which sees to bring about an end of the Iran-Iraq war, themselves become contributive to the spread to the fighting.
I got one for you. You said a few moments ago that the Gulf states were, for various reasons, unable to defend themselves. But earlier on, you indicated that an arms sale would be desirable and that there was more that they should and could do themselves. Is that a contradiction?
No, what I said was they were unable to match the scale of the United States' presence in the Gulf. But they are moving as quickly as they can, hence the purchase of high technology as opposed to low technology, military systems to, with their limited populations and geographic considerations, create the best defensive posture that they can. But anyone who's visited the region, as I said earlier, recognizes that the challenge of defending the land mass of Saudi Arabia, or the oil fields of the eastern or the western shore of the Gulf, and the offshore facilities, will know immediately that the scale is such that it would take more than the combined facilities of the GCC to be able to do that in any long-term conflict. Yes?
Well, the discussion about embargo against Iran, we have heard since 1979 during hostage taking. And since then, billions of dollars of Iranian oil has been sold to the United States, and $millions of American technology, computer, and so on and so forth has been sold to Iran. Now, when Iran gets this money from his oil, which is almost $1 million a day, he could use that, the country can use that money to purchase arms from any other country, China, South Korea. That's what he has been doing. Now, is it really rhetoric about the embargo? I mean, if there's some facts behind it.
The major suppliers of arms to the combatants, as we know, are France, Soviet Union, China, and then agents such as North Korea, Taiwan, and others.
Israel through
That's right. I firmly believe that were there a strongly supported and effective embargo resolution passed for both combatants, in other words, not discriminating one against the other, that it would be very effective.
Can I follow up on that? There are many independent arms dealers who flood the market with all manner of weapons, sophisticated, unsophisticated, etc. What type of effect would an embargo have on them? None.
I don't think that. Look at the facts of the Iran-Contra affair. It was clear that Operation Staunch was effective in limiting the flow of the more critical kinds of arms and systems that Iran needed. And in fact, with the resupply of the Hawk systems and the TOW missiles, it definitely made a qualitative difference in Iran's ability to counteract and, in fact, take the offensive against Iraq. So we can see that the violation of Operation Staunch did, in fact, show that an embargo can work, that it can make a difference in the ability of the combatants to wage war. Frankly, I think you have to recognize, too, that some of the European powers recognize, as the United States, I hope, will, that there's much more to be gained in terms of dollars and cents, if no other basis, from the rebuilding and rebirth and regrowth of Iraq and Iran than there is to continue for the military sales. Yes?
You've just said that Iran poses a greater threat to Saudi Arabia at the present time than through subversion, espionage, and sabotage than the Soviet Union does. How would this arms sale that the NAAA is supporting help impede this? And mine is actually a two-part question. Wouldn't it be wiser for the NAAA to concentrate on having the U.S. support Saudi Arabia by beefing up its domestic intelligence and security capabilities?
Well, again, we don't want the arms sale to be seen as the most critical feature of an American policy vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia or any Gulf state. We see the arms sale as just one component of enabling Saudi Arabia to take charge of its own future and its own destiny. I don't think that, obviously, the arms sale is not one that's aimed at developing Saudi capability vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. It's, as David pointed out, the reality is that the Soviet Union is there physically. It's on the Iranian border, it's on the Pakistani border, or through the Afghani situation. It has more of a presence, a physical presence in the region than the United States does. And so you can't compare our ability to support our allies in any direct way to the ability of the Soviet Union to create problems there. So I don't think you can say that the Soviet Union and Saudi Arabia are typically countries who would find themselves in conflict.
There's a point that has to be emphasized, I think, lest there be a wrong impression. John has made the point that the Saudis aren't expecting to build a military capability, or the GCC, that can, in the long run, defend against a purposeful Soviet threat, but on the other hand, see a near-term risk from the large array of arsonist, what's a better word, terrorists, blowing up facilities, this kind of thing, the very expensive facilities they've built. This is not to say at all that they do not have an effective domestic security system. Just the opposite. They have a most effective, well-organized domestic security system. I think this recent incident in Mecca is remarkable, is a factor. I talked to some Saudis who were in Mecca. They called their family to see were they okay. Their family didn't even know it had happened. They were there the same night. Saudis who were in Mecca the day after. I'm talking about the incident with the Iranians. Apparently, this incident was contained within a half hour and completely cleared and gone. My point is, the Saudis do have an extremely well-organized internal security system, and I don't think we should misinterpret the remarks made that they do see a large threat to mean that they don't have an effective internal security defense system.
Let me say that, getting back on the track for a moment of ending the conflict, if we begin with the assumption that there is no military solution to the Gulf War, there must be a political solution to the Gulf War. Our policy ought to follow from there. The question that we come forward with today is a U.S. military buildup in the Gulf sufficient, or is it even contributive to a political solution to the Gulf War? The answer we come back with is no. Do people in the region feel that it is sufficient to bring about a solution? The answer is no. So what we come down to are, what are the steps we must take to bring about a political solution to the Gulf War? Because there is no military solution to the Gulf War. And in fact, military buildup only prolongs the possibility of war and contributes to the objectives of those who see that a prolongation of the war is in their interests. And there are parties in the region who feel that a prolongation of the war is in their interests. What we need to have, and what we understand as an American policy, is that the war must end. What must we do to end the war? The first step is an arms embargo to the combatants and a truce that has teeth, that can be enforced, that brings about a negotiated settlement. And then providing the states in the region the ability to defend themselves. Those make unnecessary the kind of massive U.S. buildup that at this point is not contributive to either stability or a solution, but is a piece of a policy, as I said, that is not a peace policy in itself.
Just one last question. We'll go.
Are you going to be meeting with any administration officials or congressional figures on this?
Yes, we have in the past met on a continuing basis with the administration. We had a meeting, in fact, 2 days ago. We have requested meetings both with the NSC and with the Department of Defense, both to discuss our findings, or at least our ideas about what's going on in the Gulf and our recommendations, and also to discuss what NAAA itself might be doing vis-a-vis the arms sale. Just one other piece, as Jim pointed out early on, we feel very strongly about making Gulf policy and Middle East policy an issue for the elections. And so we have already sought meetings, and we have already received positively 3 responses where we will be working directly with the Middle East issues people on major candidates running for president, so that we can get their response and their indication as to whether or not they want to address the Gulf and the larger Middle East policy as part of their election campaigns. I'd like to remind you that there are on the door as you go out both a press statement and a summary of the finding of our visit. Thank you.
And I let my cigar go off for you. Thank you. I didn't mean to be rude. But when you came in and made it so clear how offensive it was.
I work with the America.
Huh? No. I shouldn't have had it in the closed room.
Terrible. None of us speak Arabic. His is the worst, mine is next, and his is the end. That's it.
Let's see, you know, yeah, he put in a good word in Arabic.
That's because we only had to eat breakfast together. I'm good at food. Kitchen.
That's good on the air. Whatever.
Sorry.
That's okay.
It's a major regret in my life.
Excuse me.
Actually, it's the first name on the press release.
But what you could do is just when it gets tape. Yeah, one day. Yeah, inside Zogby is almost a minute earlier.
Well, that was, you know, that was one of the major thrusts about setting up.